And we are back for our third segment of The State of Things here with Andrew Moss on the interview couch today.
All right.
Given his background as a law student, I think we'd like to talk a little bit maybe about federalism.
Ooh, yes.
Because understanding the difference between federal and state law and how much more one interacts with maybe state law on a day-to-day basis than, most people think laws. They think the government, they think it's coming from Washington, and they don't realize that the vast majority of the things that affect our lives are local. So speak to a little bit about the Federalist Society and how you've come to maybe some of your conservative conclusions from a judicial standpoint.
Well, I can go back to when I was 18. I was really kind of a political wind vane. I didn't know which way I really felt. And it was really after I got out of the military. I voted for Romney and voted for McCain in 2008, but I didn't really know what I stood for. And I think once I got out of the military is when I began that political, self-exploration. And I would call myself a libertarian for about a year and a half, and I really was into the whole, the whole idea of just
balls.
Get the government out of everything, no laws, let's have. And then it was during the midterm elections, I kind of realized, I don't know what it was. I think they were talking a discussion about immigration as like a libertarian speaking, and it was this very kind of radical, no borders kind of thing. And to me, it didn't. The idea of you want to uphold people's liberties, but get rid of laws that could potentially affect people's liberties. It seemed counterintuitive to me because I think libertarian.
Well, I think it's a matter of degree with libertarianism, where it's the utility of this style of thought is diminishing as you get farther out in the extremism of how little there should be of a centralized government.
Yeah.
I think, if we're talking about resistance to maybe government pricing schemes or onerous regulations of small business or agriculture, totally understand that discussion. But when we're talking about, I don't think there should be like an interstate highway system.
Yeah, or we should get rid of driver's licenses.
Yeah.
That's when I get a little, and that's when I kind of started getting away from that. I really became more into the Republican Party, and I got involved in the Rick Scott campaign. I volunteered for 3 days. I wasn't a big volunteer, but it was right up to election.
Was that your first experience with the campaign?
It was my very first experience in politics, and of course he won. And then about a month and a half later, I actually
Did you go to the victory party?
I went to the Players Grill. I went to the one. It was fancy. It was very fancy. I liked it. And about a month and a half later, actually, I started working on Lenny Curry's campaign for mayor. I
volunteered for Lenny as well.
And that was like ground level door knocking and doing all that. And it was fun. I liked it. And really, and then I started getting more into actually, after that campaign was over, I started actually exploring more of my ideological, what I really truly believed in more.
Like your first premises, like your first, like philosophical.
Well, and I would have there's some things, especially with abortion, I thought I knew I was pro-life, and then I would really look into things that I would think of things about, well, maybe there's actually a centralized, no, it's not this extreme.
It's not there should never be abortion or there should always be abortion. We're always going to disagree, and naturally there is going to be some conclusion here between the 40-yard lines.
And then that's when I get into more of what's government's role into it. And I think when it comes to a lot of our issues, we're talking about federalism, I think we should give great deference to states, because I think states are better equipped to not only
it's he governs best who is closest to the problem.
And that's exactly, I think a lot of people, we like you said, assume that Washington, D.C. takes care of your road outside of here on Herschel Street instead of, it's
the
actually
municipal,
the city government. And even state government has a lot of role in funding. But I think and that's where I have my idea with abortion. If abortion should be dealt with the states, and if state wants to have a very restrictive view on abortion, as long as they're not violating the spirit of Roe v. Wade, I think that's absolutely okay. And if a state wants to have very liberal views of abortion, and that's okay with me, as long as they don't violate the partial birth abortion bans, and that's
and it's in a country as wide, large, and varied as ours. People in different parts of the country are naturally going to come to different conclusions about the laws they want to govern themselves. I think we do ourselves a great disservice when we automatically look to the federal government to solve our problems. I think much of the issues we have today with gridlock and unfulfilled dreams and promises of the federal government is that we expect them to have a magic wand that fixes everything, as opposed to assuming that most problems should be dealt with at the state level and then remanding only those things that the federal government can handle to the federal government, as our Constitution would prefer.
It's funny because I think actually this gridlock in D.C. is exactly what the founders would probably want. If both sides in an argument cannot agree on an issue, then nothing should come out of D.C. And I think this is what the founders intended. That's why we have the Senate rules where you need to overcome and filibuster some issues. Because
although the way things are going, you know, Senate procedure and Senate rules might be. I mean, there's all
chopping block now. But I think there's certain things. That's why the 10th Amendment, I think, is probably, besides the First and Second, I think the 10th.
And that's for the audience. That is, all rights not specifically not enumerated to the government should be left to the states.
And I think that's my third favorite amendment, because I think it tells not only the states, but it also informs citizens that you should rely on your state legislature, you should rely on your city council to solve a lot of these local issues. In terms of, you know, one of the great things I think happened this week in Jacksonville that we don't really talk about is that the mayor and city council worked together to actually expand summer camp funding to allow thousands of kids in Jacksonville to go to summer camp, and that's huge. I mean, that's
for those kids. Oh yeah,
and it's a life-changing thing, because it not only helps these kids out, it keeps them out of certain activities that would not only hurt themselves but hurt our community in terms of crime. And that's why I think people need to focus on, you know, they don't, you know, our 2011 turnout was somewhere like 33% for our mayoral election, and 2015 was just as bad. These people decide a lot of issues, and when we get focused back on that, I think it's when we can actually good government and good citizenship should happen.
Well, and I think that a lot of the issues, a lot of the rancor and acrimony that we see in politics at the national level kind of boils down to, and this is a gross oversimplification, but California arguing with Texas. Whereas, like, when you're making a law, if it's one part of Texas arguing with the other part of Texas, their positions are naturally going to be closer together, so it's going to be easier for them to come to a compromise that satisfies their constituents. Whereas if we're approaching difficult to address maybe social problems and asking all 50 states or their representatives to agree on some sort of a plan, that's naturally going to be more difficult because of how different the people in those different states are.
And that was my issue with Obergefell v. Hodges in terms of gay marriage. I think it kind of took away that the states deciding that issue, and once again, it was people thinking that the federal government should have.
I think the federal government should have basically said, okay, we offer civil unions with all the legal and judicial rights of marriage to everybody, and if you're straight and want to get married, go to a church, and then you can say you're married. But everyone, you see what I'm saying there?
And that's where I think federalism comes into play. I think it was never the federal government. The only thing the federal government has really done in terms of marriage is they've actually made marriage really, really hard and really difficult to access for a lot of people. And it really is up to the states to kind of decide what a marriage is and what the terms of how they would get a marriage license. And that's where I think we have, once again, it's the same issue, is what is the federal government's role? And that's an issue. Unfortunately, that's not getting talked about because we're more focused on talking points instead of governing.
Well, if I were to ask you to maybe, and I'll do it before I ask you, but to distill the kind of core of your political philosophy, or what is the maybe truth that you see in the world that leads you to come to conservative conclusions. And for me, I think it goes back to Edmund Burke and valuing that cultural space between the individual and the government, what we know as society, and its ability through long practice and long tradition to administrate human affairs in such a way that keeps people happy, as opposed to assuming that there is some sort of equation that a federalized power can unlock through electing the right kind of intellectual elites to decide how to answer that question. I think it's believing in institutions like the PTA and churches, bowling leagues, tennis leagues, surfing leagues, you know, the stuff that people used to join. You know, we used to be a nation of joiners, but I think increasingly through technology and maybe through a host of different things, we're becoming more atomized individually and more separated from one another. And I think a lot of our problems could be answered by having more of a real world dialogue with each other like this, as opposed to, you know, the soundbite clips of eviscerating one another.
I agree. So really my conservative principles, I think when it comes down to what my basic belief is, I think humans are inherently really good people, and if left to their own devices, they will decide, they will act in a way that not only benefits them but benefits others. And the government, I think we have seen the government is really full of these same humans who have good intentions, but unfortunately the way government works, they're not really responsive to a lot of issues, especially in the federal government.
Well, there aren't the natural mechanisms of accountability that are there in capitalism.
I agree. And really, so when I look at a problem, I think of, well, what can it be solved by people instead of getting the government involved, and at what level of government should be involved in terms of that problem?
Well, it's approaching most problems from how do we solve this without getting the government involved unless we have to.
And I think the federal government's, my belief is the federal government's proper role is to keep the national security of this country.
Defense, borders, and that's things like interstate, like the interstate system.
Interstate, yeah. And if the federal government can properly fulfill those roles,
diplomacy, treaties, that sort of thing.
Everything else, and economics and anything else will fall in the line, because that's we have the 50 states for to decide majority of these issues. But it's really just I don't want to say it's a libertarian aspect, because I'm not really that anymore. But it's just a matter of believing that human nature is good, and that
humans have the capacity to decide how to govern themselves,
that are better than a bureaucrat in D.C. or better than someone in Tallahassee can tell them what to do. But it seems like now that conservatism's kind of it's
adrift.
It's interesting, you know.
Well, and I'll very briefly explain my thoughts on where we are. I think since the collapse of the Soviet Union, conservatism hasn't had a foil that allows us to define ourselves. Because for so long in our history, it was Republicans are saying the Soviets are evil and Democrats are saying Republicans are evil. Eventually, when the Soviets aren't there and the Democrats still get to say Republicans are evil, and we don't have that foil against which to define ourselves, we were kind of adrift. Now, we went through the Clinton presidency in the 90s and didn't really, we went through the Republican Revolution in 94 with Newt Gingrich. But when Bush came in, we did have an opportunity to really define what republicanism was in the absence of a major military conflict. But then 9/11 happens, and so we go another 15 years without figuring out who we are now.
And it's funny because, I mean, look at the first Republican debate was in Ronald Reagan's presidential library, and I think that's still the gold standard, especially me as a conservative. I look back to the words of Ronald Reagan in terms of how he dealt with especially foreign policy and domestic policy. I mean, people will argue that he increased the national deficit, but they don't talk about the fact that GDP growth is over 5%. You know, he doubled and tripled GDP growth. He
allowed inflation to soar to get out of the stagflation of the 70s.
And it was just, I mean, just that optimism that I think conservatism is. It's people can do this. If we leave people alone, they will be able to solve their problems. And as years pass away from a Reagan presidency, it gets less and less influential. And I think the Bush years kind of didn't really. It kind of stained us.
It was basically treading water.
It was basically treading water, and then almost people thought of conservatism as this, militaristic, very
fighting wars,
statism kind of thing. But I think
basically large statism with a more aggressive foreign policy,
and with a focus on a lesser federal government role
in business.
But I think though you see the Ben Sasses and the Marco Rubio and the Nikki Haley's of the Republican Party. I think those are
Justin Amash.
And those are going to be the future of the Republican Party in terms of the thinking, and hopefully the coalition of different kind of Republican views. I always admire the Republican Party for having these libertarian Republicans, these centrist
actually having honest disagreements that are difficult to
like the debate stage. I mean, you had a Rand Paul versus a Marco Rubio. It couldn't be different on foreign policy, but they're still calling themselves Republicans. I think we need, especially when it comes to defining conservatism, what the Republican Party stands for. That's where we're going to have to get back to.
Well, and I think we're going through the process of redefining conservatism now. But once again, time flies and we are up against it. But we will see you back for our next segment of The State of Things here with Andrew Moss today.
All right.